for the introduction and very much also for the invitation, Nicoletta. And thanks for the organizers for putting together this panel. Today, I'm going to talk about an example of innovative finance for global health and the vaccine bonds, and then look at some of the hidden costs of financialization. And as Nicoletta said, this is based on my PhD research, which is, and I want to quickly set the scene of the context. So the research was really looking into the increased role of private finance in development and the financialization of development and healthcare more specifically. And we see calls for this specifically in one of the SDGs in the UN that wants to unlock the transformative power of trillions of dollars of private resources, specifically the World Bank's from billions to trillions mantra, and then also in an academic context, research on the financialization of development, movement beyond aid, and a shift towards development finance. And here I added the focus on new innovative development finance schemes, of which today I want to talk about one case study that I have written up also with my supervisor on IFIM, the International Finance Facility for Immunization. And this is based on research using a follow the money approach, which I developed also as part of my PhD. So why look at IFIM? Well, it's really a very interesting example of the financialization of global health. It's very much an emblematic example of innovative development finance, and it's celebrated in both the development world and in the finance world. In terms of scale, it's a really significant and important actor in global health on the world stage. And then more recently, it was used as a funding vehicle for COVID-19 vaccines, and specifically also for the COVAX AMC, which I'm looking forward to hearing more about from Felix in the next talk. So very quickly, what IFIM is doing is raising funding or providing funding in support of Gavi. So I want to quickly say a word on who Gavi are so that we're all at the same starting point. That Gavi is the public-private partnership, as we just heard about, that brings together a range of important actors in the health space, the WHO, UNICEF, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the World Bank, many donors and implementing country governments, vaccine manufacturers, and other private sector partners. So the significance in terms of scale of Gavi is large in the sense that it claims to vaccinate almost half of the world's children against infectious diseases. So it has a very significant reach. And its biggest donors historically have been the UK, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the US, and Norway. It's important to note there have been some interesting and important critiques of Gavi and the way it works, but I won't go into those in the scope of this talk today. Where I want to focus on IFIM, which is this innovative funding mechanism targeting immunization specifically. And what IFIM is in terms of size is that it's secured over $8 billion in donor commitments from 10 different governments. The largest of those are the UK and France. It's disbursed over $3 billion to Gavi, which accounts for over 20% of its funding. And that was much larger in Gavi's earlier years, accounting for more like half of Gavi's funding. It's issued 38 bonds and raised over $8 billion from investors. It was founded back in 2006, but is very much active today in issuing bonds and in providing funds to Gavi and securing commitments from governments. Its raison d'être is that this key benefit of the idea of accelerating the availability of money or front loading. In IFIM's words, there's zero value vaccinating a child in 10 years' time if he or she dies from a vaccine preventable disease this year. And how it does this is that IFIM receives these long-term legally binding pledges from donor governments, issues vaccine bonds off those pledges, and uses that money raised to fund Gavi. And in a paper, we looked at the politics of IFIM, the financing model, and looking also at the geography of it. But for today, our focus very much on looking at IFIM's financing model. And to do that, I want to walk through in a little bit more detail the simplified version of how the IFIM model works. So first, donor governments sign irrevocable grant agreements to Gavi, who assign the right to receive that grant to IFIM. Off the back of those agreements, IFIM issues vaccine bonds in capital markets to institutional investors, typically, and those it therefore receives bond issue proceeds at that moment, which it can use to provide disbursements to Gavi, who go on to use it for their vaccine programs and health system strengthening activities. Donor governments later make a payment on their grant agreements as they're scheduled over typically 10, 15, or 20 years, every year a payment. And IFIM can use that to repay the interest and principal on the bonds that it's issued. Throughout the process, IFIM incurs various fees to private sector institutions, the financial institutions, to arrange the bond issuances and a range of professional services. I want to flash up a slightly more complete view of the flow of money in IFIM. It also has significant operations with the World Bank as its treasury manager to manage a significant investment portfolio, and is also involved in very significant volume of hedging transactions. So the three key themes I want to look at today, and they're aligned with the three key benefits that proponents claim for the IFIM model. The first is this front loading of funds, or making funding available today. The second is that it operates with low cost of funding. And the third is the idea of leveraging private sector funds. And what I want to do is, using this follow the money approach, examine each of these three claims in turn. So first, let's follow the money through the pledges and grants. So this is up to 2019, before some disruptions to IFIM's way of operating, let's say, began with the pandemic. So these figures are from 2006, when IFIM started, up to 2019. By that point, donor governments had agreed to pledge $6.5 billion to Gavi, and IFIM had disbursed $2.9 billion to Gavi. And it had 400 million on its balance sheet, that's liabilities that it was going to commit to paying to Gavi. So we'll include those as well in funding that Gavi was going to receive. So the question is, what's really the front loading, and where did the rest of the money go, the difference between the 6.5 billion and the about 3.5 billion that Gavi would receive? Now, first, looking at the funds that Gavi's received in orange, and the promises that governments made in blue, what we can see is a very clear front-loading effect, especially in the first few years. So the sums that Gavi receives from IFIM significantly outstrip the funding that governments have had to pay to IFIM. So that pulling forward and making the funding available sooner, of the 6.5 billion in promises, making 2.2 billion available only in those first couple of years. But the effect does significantly tailor off, even though IFIM is signing new pledges and issuing new bonds. And what's hiding in plain sight between this front loading is high costs. And those costs of IFIM's operating model represent a significant profit opportunity for certain actors. And what we find in following the money through is that over $1 billion has been paid in interest and in redemption payments that are made above the issue price to bondholders. $33 million have been paid in fees to financial institutions for the bond issuance. 22 million have been paid in fees to professional services firms, so that's mainly lawyers, auditors, insurance. And then 29 million has been paid in fees to the World Bank, who acts as IFIM's treasury manager. And altogether, what this means is that we find over $1 billion has been paid out and in forms that represent some kind of return or profit for those actors receiving them. As points of comparison, this sum of over $1 billion represents 35% of the $3 billion in donor payments that have been received so far, and 17% of the $6.5 billion in donor pledges that have been made up until this point. So it's a significantly expensive model. And finally, turning to that third claim around leveraging private sector funds, which underpins a lot of narratives in health financialization more broadly, is that we find no real additionality in aid. So IFIM is borrowing from private sources, from the bondholders, and temporarily these go to Gavi. But ultimately, donor governments are the source of the payments to Gavi, and the rest is channeled to the private sector in the form of interest and fees. So the reality we find is rather the opposite of mobilizing and catalyzing private resources narratives. And instead, we find that non-trivial resources are peeled off by private financial actors as money flows through these innovative finance schemes. So if we look at a summary of the findings, there's some front-loading effect that's quite significant in the first couple of years, but limited impact later on. And in fact, we find the opposite of a low cost of funding, that the model is very expensive, and it rather resources are peeled off to the private sector rather than leveraging them as such. So given these fairly significant opportunity costs, the question is, are there alternatives? And I've come at this in two ways. That first, we could think about an alternative financing model where donor governments would borrow through long-term bonds themselves to fund Gavi directly, which delivers the same front-loading effect for Gavi at a lower cost of funding, and it would also have some benefits of being more open to democratic scrutiny and not have the same concentration around existing financial centers and actors who then take on that role in global health. So this would be an alternative financing model aiming at delivering the same front loading of funds for health, but with slightly fewer opportunity costs. Or we could think about identifying a different problem. So rather than taking IFIM's approach of diagnosing the problem of access to immunization for children in low-income countries as an investment gap, we could rather look at a range of different problems around high pharmaceutical prices, healthcare infrastructure, or the ability for the Gavi target countries to raise sufficient taxes. And along with those, there could be a range of different solutions around intellectual property right law, grant funding, or other forms of direct funding, or some reforms to international tax systems. And the point here is that given these very significant opportunity costs, to show that there are alternatives to this financialized approach and innovative finance approach to healthcare. So I'll wrap up with a few conclusions. The first is that it's worth recognizing that IFIM has made a significant contribution to global health, including to the COVID-19 response, in terms of mobilizing funds for vaccines. But a detailed examination of its financial model, taking this follow the money approach, reveals very significant opportunity costs. And this model, a key one among those costs is that there are significant opportunities for private profit hiding in plain sight in the context of explicit social goals. And while IFIM front loads aid, there's no aid additionality, this narrative of catalyzing and mobilizing private finance. We find instead rather the reverse is happening. And then finally, again, to emphasize that there are alternative financial models and alternative solutions.